My name is Genevieve Carter. I'm 43 years old. For most of my life, I served as a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army. I've survived war zones, lost friends I called brothers and sisters, and carried secrets I'll take to my grave. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for the moment. My own brother stood up in court, pointed at me, and screamed, "She's just a fake veteran." The words echoed in my head like gunfire. I remember the sudden stillness in the courtroom, the collective gasp, the confusion, the disgust. I could feel every eye in that room piercing through me, stripping away decades of service, sacrifice, and honor in the blink of an eye. But I didn't flinch. I didn't cry. I simply reached into my briefcase and pulled out the thin tan folder I had been holding on to for almost 2 years. My fingers barely trembled. I stood, walked forward, and placed it quietly on the judge's desk. He flipped the first page, and then everything stopped. The judge's eyes darkened. His voice dropped to a whisper, but I heard every word as if it were shouted through a megaphone. "No one move. Close the doors now." Military police uniforms, crisp boots. Heavy marched into the courtroom. My brother's lawyer, the same man who had smirked at me just minutes earlier, dropped every single paper in his hands. The color drained from his face. "Douglas?" My brother stumbled backward. My mother's lips parted, but no words came out. My family went pale, haunted, cornered, exposed. In that moment, I wasn't the disgrace they thought I was. I wasn't the black sheep. I was the woman who had come home, not to beg, not to prove myself, but to end the lies they'd been weaving behind my back for years. And I knew deep in my bones, this was only the beginning. I didn't always imagine life would bring me here. Before the lawsuits, before the betrayal, before the courtroom. There was just me, the sea, and the old weathered house my father left behind, a house perched on the cliffs of Monterey Bay. It wasn't much, but it was home. I can still remember the sound of the waves crashing against the rocks, the smell of salt in the air, and my father's voice, when he told me long before I shipped off to my first deployment. "Some things, Evie, you have to protect no matter the cost." I had believed him. I had lived by those words. I spent 20 years overseas, watching the world fall apart and stitching myself back together with pieces of borrowed courage. When I came home, I didn't expect fanfare. I didn't need gratitude. I only wanted one thing: to belong again. But home wasn't the same. My father was gone. The man who once held our family together had left behind a will, a simple one, really splitting his modest estate among his 3 children. I was left with the house I loved. Douglas, my older brother, took control of the family's business. Mason, my youngest brother, stayed mostly quiet, always the observer. For a few brief weeks, I thought it might be enough. I thought maybe we could start over. Then the envelope arrived. A thick, heavy packet of legal documents, and with it the betrayal I never saw coming. I sat in my kitchen, hands resting on the cold marble countertop, as I read every line of the lawsuit. Douglas and my mother, my own flesh and blood, accused me of fraud. They claimed I had never truly served, that I had forged my military records to gain favor in our father's will. Worse, they alleged I had defrauded the government, stealing benefits meant for real veterans. The audacity of it made me sick. 20 years. Shrapnel still buried in my shoulder. Nights I couldn't sleep without waking up in a cold sweat. But none of that mattered. Not to them. The court summons was clear. I had 30 days to appear. I remember looking across the table at Mason. His eyes avoided mine, as they often did. He was always the quiet one, the peacemaker. But something flickered in his gaze. Hesitation, sadness, or guilt, I couldn't tell. He offered no words, and I realized I would stand alone. The weeks that followed were a blur of preparation and numbness. I gathered every piece of evidence, every official document, every medal, every photograph. But more than anything, I prepared myself for what I knew would hurt the most. The realization that my family had chosen greed over blood. I had fought for my country. Now I would have to fight for my name. The courtroom was colder than I expected. Not physically, but emotionally. The air felt thin, the lights too bright, the faces too many. I sat straight-backed in a dark navy dress suit. No uniform, no medals. Just Genevieve Carter, the woman they wanted to destroy. Douglas sat to my right. My mother clutched his arm, her expression hard as stone. Mason, as always, sat at the edge, eyes down, barely breathing. The moment came faster than I thought. Douglas rose, and with a venom I didn't recognize in his voice, he said the words that would forever etch themselves into my memory. "She's just a fake veteran." I heard gasps, saw heads turn, but I kept my face still. My hands didn't shake. I knew this was the point of no return. The judge asked for evidence. Douglas's lawyer presented doctored documents, twisted timelines, and false narratives. Every word, every glance, every accusation was designed to strip me bare, not just legally, but personally, to erase who I was. When my turn came, I didn't speak. Not right away. Instead, I reached for the file, the one Mason had quietly slid into my hands just days before, the one containing every piece of truth they thought I'd never find. I walked forward, I placed it on the judge's desk, and I waited. What happened next would change everything. But in that moment, I was just a soldier once more, calm, steady, unbroken. I was never the daughter they wanted. From as early as I can remember, I was different. Not rebellious, not loud, just different. While Douglas, my older brother, was molded to inherit the family business, and Mason, the baby of the family, was coddled into silence, I drifted somewhere in between, restless and unseen. My parents built their lives around Carter and Sons Holdings, a string of boutique hotels that defined not just our wealth, but our identity. Every dinner conversation, every holiday, every decision revolved around the business. Even as a child, I could sense the undercurrent. Loyalty to the family meant loyalty to the business. But I didn't fit. I didn't care about quarterly earnings or client lists. I cared about stories of courage, justice, and freedom, things I read in dusty library books, while the others learned profit margins. I remember once around age 10, my father caught me reading a biography of Harriet Tubman. He smiled, sat beside me, and said, "One day you'll find something worth fighting for." But my mother didn't smile. She always looked at me like I was an unfinished puzzle she couldn't solve. Douglas thrived under their gaze. He learned early how to charm them, how to echo their ambitions. I watched from the sidelines as he transformed into the golden son, always right, always praised. Mason, on the other hand, was a different story. He was gentle, quiet. He hid in the corners with his books like me, but unlike me, he never defied them. I protected Mason the best I could. I remember covering for him when he skipped sports practice or forgot homework. There was a softness to him that I recognized because it was the part of me I had to bury to survive in that house. But despite the fragile bond Mason and I shared, the truth was stark in that family love was conditional. And the condition was obedience. When I first mentioned joining the army, it wasn't a conversation. It was a battlefield. My mother wept. Douglas scoffed. Even Mason looked away. But I left anyway. At 18, with nothing but a duffel bag, and my father's last words ringing in my ears, I walked out. And none of them followed me. War changes you. Anyone who tells you different never really went to war. I spent the next 2 decades of my life wearing the uniform, serving in places whose names most people can't pronounce. I became an officer. I led men and women into situations where we all knew we might not come back. And sometimes we didn't. My first deployment to Afghanistan was the first time I felt truly alive. The desert heat, the weight of body armor, the hum of helicopters overhead, it all carved something sharp and solid inside me. For the first time, I wasn't the daughter who didn't belong. I was Lieutenant Carter. I mattered. But with that belonging came loss. I remember every face I couldn't save. Every letter I wrote to families who would never hold their loved ones again. The blast that tore through my convoy left me with shrapnel lodged in my shoulder, nerve damage that never fully healed, and nightmares that visit without invitation. Honor and duty carried me through, but they left scars, some visible, most not. And yet I never resented those years, because I knew who I was when I wore that uniform. I earned every medal, every salute, every line on the folded flag handed to grieving parents. When I finally came home, older, harder, quieter, I carried those years inside me. I wasn't naive enough to expect my family to understand, but I thought, perhaps foolishly, that they might at least respect it. They didn't. At family dinners, Douglas would change the subject every time my service came up. My mother looked away. Mason stayed silent as always. It became clear that to them my years in uniform were not a badge of honor, but an inconvenient detour from the life they expected me to lead. But I had no regrets, Because the military taught me something that would one day save me, that battles are not always fought with guns, but with resilience. And that survival in the end is the ultimate form of defiance. When my father died, everything changed, and everything stayed the same. He passed quietly in his sleep in the very house I would one day fight to keep. There was no drama, no grand final words, just absence. The funeral was a polished affair, suits whispered condolences, and a family that looked whole only on the outside. I stood beside Douglas and Mason as the casket was lowered. I could almost hear my father's voice. "Some things, Evie, you have to protect." The reading of the will came 2 weeks later. I didn't expect much. After all, I had been the estranged daughter, the soldier who vanished. But when the lawyer announced that my father had left me the Monterey house, our family's oldest property, the tension in the room thickened. Douglas's jaw tightened. My mother's lips pressed into a thin line. Mason, as always, said nothing. But I noticed his eyes wider than usual, darting between us. The house wasn't worth millions, but it meant something. It was history, memory, roots. Douglas inherited the business as expected. Mason received a trust fund. I received a home. And for a brief moment I thought maybe, just maybe, we could move forward. But greed has deep roots. And less than a month later, the first legal notice arrived. They claimed I had manipulated our father, that my military service was fabricated, that I had stolen valor and by extension tainted the will. They demanded the house, the inheritance, and my silence. I was stunned. Not because they wanted more, I had always known Douglas's hunger for control, but because they were willing to erase everything I was to get it. The betrayal wasn't in the lawsuit. It was in the faces of the people who should have stood beside me, and instead chose to bury me. I knew then the real war had only just begun. The moment the lawsuit became public, my life changed overnight. It started with whispers. Then the headlines came online, blogs, tabloids, even local news. Decorated soldier or master fraud, the Genevieve Carter scandal. I remember staring at my own photograph splashed across the screen, the word fraud in bold letters underneath. My phone buzzed constantly, reporters, distant relatives, old college friends, all of them either demanding answers or quietly drifting away. I became a ghost in my own town, the local cafe where I used to grab my morning coffee. The barista stopped making eye contact. Neighbors I had known for years now crossed the street to avoid me. I could see it in their eyes, doubt, suspicion, judgment. But the deepest cuts came from those I once called friends. Some sent polite but distant messages, thinking of you, while others disappeared without a word. Invitations dried up, smiles faded. Even the Veterans Association I belonged to hesitated, reaching out only to request clarification on my status. The isolation weighed heavier than any battlefield deployment I had endured. Douglas and my mother, meanwhile, pressed forward relentlessly. Their legal team was ruthless, feeding the media, leaking doctored documents, twisting half-truths into damning narratives. They painted me not only as a fraud, but as an ungrateful daughter, a disgrace to both family and country. Every time I saw my mother's face on television calmly stating how concerned she was about my well-being, I felt the same sick churn in my stomach. How easily she smiled for the cameras while stabbing me from behind. And Mason, he remained silent. Or so I thought. The worst part wasn't the legal battle itself. It was the gnawing fear that maybe, just maybe, people would believe them. That the years I had poured into serving my country, the sacrifices, the scars, the memories, none of it would matter if the world decided to write a different story. I started doubting myself. I started to feel unmoored. I would wake at night drenched in sweat, the lines between my battlefield nightmares and this new war blurring together. But somewhere in that darkness, something hardened inside me. I wasn't going to let them win. Not like this. I knew I couldn't fight this battle with emotions. I had to find the truth. The real truth hidden beneath years of family secrets and carefully constructed lies. The first clue came unexpectedly. A text message. From Mason. It was short. Just 5 words: "We need to talk. Alone." I met him late one evening at the very cliffs where my father used to take us when we were children. The wind was cold. The sea roared below. Mason stood there, arms crossed, visibly nervous. He had aged since the last time I really looked at him. Lines traced his forehead. His eyes, though, were the same, soft, troubled, distant. "I never wanted this," he said quietly. I didn't know how far they'd go. He handed me a small flash drive. No explanations, no promises. Just, I thought you should see this. Back home, I plugged it in with shaking hands. What I found left me breathless. Emails between Douglas and our mother sent months before our father's death. Discussions about altering the will. Financial documents showing money moved into offshore accounts. Money linked to veterans' charities I never even knew Douglas was involved with. They had used my name, my service, my image to create a fraudulent paper trail that benefited them while painting me as the scapegoat. There were even drafts of press releases accusing me of stolen valor months before I even knew there was a problem. I sat frozen, the weight of the betrayal suffocating. But what cut deepest wasn't the scheme itself. It was Mason, the boy I had protected, the one I thought I had lost to the family machine. He had chosen, finally painfully, to do the right thing. And that left me with a choice of my own. I could take this evidence and burn them to the ground. Or I could find a way to win without becoming like them. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I drafted my plan carefully, methodically, letting every emotion, every shred of heartbreak fuel my determination. They thought they knew me. They thought I would break. But they forgot soldiers don't quit. The next morning, I looked at myself in the mirror for a long time. The reflection staring back wasn't the woman who left for basic training at 18. It wasn't the soldier who survived IED blasts and desert ambushes. It wasn't the woman who wept when she received her first commendation. It was something different, something quieter. Steadier, I saw Genevieve Carter, the woman who refused to be erased. I gathered every piece of evidence, not just Mason's files, but my own service records, testimonials from former commanders, letters from soldiers. I had led photographs, medals, everything that told the real story of who I was. But I also gathered something else: perspective. I realized then that my fight wasn't just about the house, or the inheritance, or even my name. It was about something far greater. It was about dignity, about truth, about the quiet defiance of standing your ground when the world wants to shove you into silence. I could have gone public. I could have screamed from rooftops. But instead, I chose precision. I chose law. I chose integrity. I hired the best forensic accountants, legal minds, and digital investigators. Every step was deliberate. Every move designed not to humiliate, but to reveal. And through it all, Mason stood beside me. He didn't speak much. He still fumbled with words, still looked away when emotions ran too high. But he stayed. That mattered. The day before the final court hearing, I returned to the Monterey house. I walked through each room, touching the walls, remembering the echoes of my father's laughter. I sat on the porch as the sun dipped below the horizon, the salty breeze brushing against my skin. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't bitter. I was ready. They had declared war on my character, on my memories, on everything I held sacred. But I was done playing their game. I would let the truth speak for itself. And this time, I wouldn't flinch. The courtroom felt colder that morning, not because of the air conditioning or the marble floors, but because of the weight pressing down on every breath I took. There was a heaviness to the silence that stretched between each word, spoken attention so thick it could have been cut with a knife. I sat at my table, hands resting flat back, straight eyes forward. I could hear the soft shuffle of papers, the muted coughs, the hushed whispers of onlookers. But I tuned them out. I had to. Douglas was seated across from me, his lawyer to his left, my mother on his right. They looked composed on the surface, calm, polished, unbothered. But I noticed the small cracks, the tightness in Douglas's jaw, the way his fingers drummed rhythmically on the table's edge, the way my mother kept her eyes fixed on a point somewhere above the judge's head, as if she couldn't bear to meet mine. And then there was Mason. He sat behind them, one row back, hands folded in his lap, gaze pinned to the floor. Not a word, not a glance, not a sign of allegiance. For a moment, I felt the old ache, the memory of the quiet little boy who used to follow me around the garden, who would tug on my sleeve when the others shouted, who once whispered that he wished he could be brave like me. I wondered if that boy still existed, or if, like so much else in this family, he had been buried beneath decades of control and silence. The judge called us to order. The attorneys rose, and the performance began. Douglas's lawyer was slick, every word polished to a mirror shine. He spoke of family values, of concern for rightful inheritance, of irregularities in my military record. He presented charts, timelines, printouts, each designed to chip away at my credibility, to plant seeds of doubt in the judge's mind. I watched without blinking. I had expected every move. I had mapped out their strategy months ago when the first notice arrived. My attorney stood, calm, precise. She dismantled their arguments methodically, piece by piece, never once raising her voice. She presented my service record verified and notarized. She showed commendations letters from commanders, even photos from the field, things I had never intended to use as weapons, now forced into evidence to defend the life I had built. But as the hours dragged on, the air in the room grew thinner. Douglas took the stand. I sat frozen as he raised his hand, swore his oath, and looked straight into the judge's eyes with the same charm he had used on business investors for years. He spoke of family loyalty, of strange behavior, of how I had distanced myself for decades, only to reappear at the reading of the will. He painted me as unstable, as opportunistic, as someone who had worn the uniform but never truly earned it. And then he said it, the words that made my blood run cold. "She's just a fake veteran." A ripple passed through the room, not loud but palpable. I kept my eyes on him, steady, unmoving, but inside something cracked. My mother was called next. Her testimony was colder, more restrained. She spoke softly, almost regretfully, about her concerns over my mental state, my supposed fabrications, her fear that the inheritance had been unfairly influenced. I listened, silent, every word carved deeper, not just into my case, but into the memory of the woman who had once kissed my scraped knees and braided my hair. And still Mason said nothing. I stole a glance at him once, just once. His hands were clasped so tightly, his knuckles had turned white. His jaw was clenched, his eyes never lifted. The judge called for a recess. As I stepped outside into the corridor, I exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. My legs trembled, my throat burned. But I refused to let it show. The reporters were waiting, cameras, microphones, questions I didn't answer. I kept walking, one step at a time, one breath at a time. Back inside, as the session resumed, I could feel the balance of the room shift ever so slightly. The weight of the evidence, the cracks in their story, the subtle unease in the judge's eyes as he listened. But nothing was certain yet. I knew this was only the middle of the battle. The real turning point had not yet come. And Mason remained the question mark. Would he speak, would he stay silent, or would he in the end find the courage to choose the truth I didn't know? But I was ready either way. When I think of Mason, I don't think of the man sitting silently in that courtroom. I think of the boy he used to be, the boy with the two big glasses, the dog-eared books, the quiet voice that barely rose above a whisper. Mason was always different from Douglas and me. While Douglas chased approval and control, and I chased freedom and distance, Mason hid. He was the quiet observer in a family of performers. He was the only one who never demanded, never competed, never raised his voice. And maybe that's why I always felt closer to him even when we were worlds apart. Growing up, I was his protector. I remember the nights he'd sneak into my room after another one of my parents' fights with Douglas. His small hands gripping a worn stuffed animal, his eyes wide with confusion. He never asked for much, just the comfort of being seen. Just the safety of silence. But as we grew older, Mason drifted further into the background. He played his role well, the agreeable son, the neutral party. He never challenged our parents, never questioned Douglas, never picked a side. I sometimes wondered if he even knew who he was beneath the layers of deference and avoidance. That's why in the courtroom I couldn't read him. He sat like a statue, expressionless, detached. And I wondered, was he still the boy I used to know? Or had he finally chosen comfort over conscience? But the answer had already begun to take shape long before the trial. It started 2 weeks earlier on a cold, gray afternoon. I was sitting alone on the back porch of the Monterey house when Mason appeared without warning. He stood awkwardly at the edge of the wooden steps, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets, his eyes fixed on the horizon. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then quietly he said, "I'm sorry." I remember looking at him, really looking at him, and realizing how tired he seemed. how worn thin by years of being pulled in every direction. "Why are you here, Mason?" I asked, my voice as soft as the wind. He hesitated. His lips pressed together, then parted. I never wanted it to go this far. I thought they'd stop. I swallowed hard. "They won't stop. You know that." He nodded slowly. Then from his pocket he pulled out a small flash drive. No words. Just the quiet offer of something fragile, something dangerous. "What is it?" I asked, my heart already pounding. "Emails," he said. "Financial statements. I found them months ago." His voice faltered. I should have said something sooner. I took the drive from his trembling hand. It felt heavier than any weapon I had ever carried. "Mason, why now?" I whispered. He looked away, eyes glistening. "Because you're the only one who ever stood up for me. Even when we were kids. Even when you had no reason to. I can't keep pretending. I can't be part of this." For a moment the wind carried only the sound of the ocean crashing against the cliffs. And I saw for the first time the man Mason could have been all along, the one buried beneath fear, beneath loyalty to the wrong people. I wanted to tell him it was okay. That he didn't owe me anything, but the truth was his decision changed everything. In the courtroom, as I watched him sit motionless, I knew the war inside him hadn't ended. He was still trapped between two worlds, the family that raised him and the truth he had finally chosen to protect. That's the thing about betrayal. It doesn't just cut one way. Mason had betrayed Douglas and my mother by giving me the key to their downfall. But he had also betrayed the version of himself that had survived by staying silent. And I understood that better than anyone. The day after he gave me the drive, I stayed up all night reviewing the documents. They were damning. They revealed the timeline of manipulation, the false charities, the forged amendments to the will. But more than that, they revealed intent, a cold, calculated conspiracy that no courtroom could ignore. Mason had held onto them for months. I could only imagine the nights he lay awake, the weight of those secrets pressing on his chest. I knew the cost of what he'd done. I knew that by choosing me he would lose them. Perhaps forever. And so in that courtroom, when he sat so still, I didn't press him. I didn't demand he take the stand or speak out. I let him have that quiet. Because sometimes the bravest thing a person can do isn't to shout, but to act in silence. Mason's dilemma wasn't over. But he had made his choice. And now it was my turn to finish what he had started. There's something unnerving about watching people you once loved turn into strangers. Worse, into enemies. As the trial progressed, Douglas's tactics grew darker, more desperate. He wasn't content to let the legal process unfold. No, he wanted to win by any means necessary. And if that meant destroying me completely, my reputation, my dignity, my sanity, he would do it without blinking. The first blow came through the press. Carefully crafted headlines appeared in local papers and online blogs. Questions surfaced over decorated veteran service claims and family feud. Over multi-million-dollar estate raises eyebrows. At first I ignored them. I thought they'd fade, but they didn't. They multiplied, fueled by anonymous sources, who spun half-truths into character assassination. The words they used haunted me, emotionally unstable, estranged from family for decades, possible falsification of military service. Each phrase chipped away at the truth I had spent my life living. It was Douglas's signature-style smear, first deny, later. I watched with disbelief as old photos of me in uniform were dissected online by armchair critics, some claiming the medals weren't real, others questioning the authenticity of my deployment stories. People I'd never met passed judgment on a life they couldn't possibly understand. But it didn't stop there. Douglas had money, influence. He used both. Documents, clever forgeries began surfacing. A fabricated letter supposedly from my commanding officer casting doubt on my service record. A doctored medical file suggesting I had never been injured overseas. Even a false psychological evaluation implying I suffered from delusions. I sat with my legal team reviewing each piece of so-called evidence, my stomach turning. Every forged signature, every digital manipulation, every twist of fact. It was like being erased in real time. The worst of it, though, wasn't the lies in the newspapers. It was the manipulation inside the family. Douglas had always been my mother's favorite. But now he weaponized that loyalty with surgical precision. I heard whispers of the things he told her behind closed doors. That I was dangerous. That I was mentally unstable. that I had returned not to mourn our father, but to steal what wasn't mine. I saw it in her eyes when she passed me in the courtroom corridor, an emptiness where once there had been something resembling maternal warmth. She didn't speak to me. She barely looked at me. It was as if I had already been disowned, erased not by law but by choice. It's a particular kind of heartbreak, realizing your own mother has chosen to believe the worst about you. Not because she has proof, but because it's easier. Easier to follow Douglas's version of reality than to face the possibility that her golden child could be capable of deception. I wrestled with the bitterness every night. I lay awake replaying every moment from our childhood, every Christmas morning, every scraped knee she tended, every lullaby she hummed. I searched for signs, for clues, for anything that could have warned me that one day she would stand silently as her son destroyed her daughter. And then there was Mason. Mason became the quiet center of the storm. Neither openly defiant nor fully complicit, he drifted in and out of conversations, his face a mask of conflict. I knew he was carrying the weight of what he'd given me the evidence on that flash drive, and I knew it was tearing him apart. Douglas noticed too. I saw how Douglas leaned in during breaks, whispering to Mason with that rehearsed smile. I saw the subtle touches on the shoulder, the careful nods, the cold calculation behind every gesture. He was reeling Mason back and playing on guilt, on fear, on the old family script, loyalty. Above truth appearances, above integrity. It sickened me. But I knew better than to intervene. Mason had to come to his decision on his own. If I pushed, I risked losing the only fragile thread of honesty left in our bloodline. In the quiet moments, those brief suffocating pauses between testimonies, I caught Mason's eyes across the courtroom. His expression unreadable, but I recognized the fracture. The slow, inevitable breaking of someone forced to choose between the family that raised him and the truth that could set him free. And still, I remained standing. I chose silence not because I was weak, but because I knew that some battles aren't won through shouting. They're won through endurance, through patience, through letting the truth rise when the lies collapse under their own weight. Douglas had thrown everything at me: the media, the forged documents, the family bonds he twisted into weapons. And yet I stood, bruised but not broken, alone but not defeated. And I knew with absolute certainty that the closer we came to the verdict, the more desperate he would become. The war wasn't over, not yet, but the tides were beginning to turn. The night before the final hearing, I sat alone in the Monterey house, staring out the window as the waves crashed against the rocks below. The air smelled of salt and memory. My hands rested on the old wooden table where my father used to sit with me, tracing maps of places I'd later see with my own eyes in uniform. This house was more than inheritance. It was the last unbroken piece of who I used to be before the world, before the family, before the war. I had made my decision long ago. I wasn't going to bend. I wasn't going to bargain. No matter what Douglas threw at me, no matter how many lies, no matter how much they twisted my history, I would stand. Even if I stood alone. But deep down, I knew I wasn't the only one still undecided. Mason. He had become the quiet heart of this storm. He held the key, the truth hidden in that flash drive, and yet he hadn't spoken a single word in court. He sat through every accusation, every bitter glance, every twisted story, without so much as lifting his eyes. I had stopped hoping for his help. I told myself that whatever choice he made, I would respect it. But in truth, a part of me, the small, fragile part that still believed in family, waited. Silently, painfully. It was just after midnight when I heard the knock. I opened the door to find Mason standing there, drenched in mist, hands shoved deep into his coat pockets, his face pale beneath the porch light. For a moment we just looked at each other, neither of us speaking. Then he exhaled sharp and shaky and said, "I can't sleep." I stepped aside. "Come in." He sat in the living room, the same room where we once built blanket forts as kids. His eyes drifted across the framed photographs on the mantel, our family in better years. My father's laugh forever frozen in glass. "I hate him," Mason whispered, barely audible. "I hate what he's done. But she." He shook his head. "She's still our mother." I lowered myself into the armchair opposite him. "I know," he swallowed hard. "If I say something, if I testify, she'll never forgive me." I didn't reply right away. Instead, I let the silence sit between us, heavy and honest. Finally, I said, "Sometimes doing the right thing costs you everything. Sometimes it's not about what you lose. It's about what you can live with when it's over." His eyes found mine, then filled with something I hadn't seen in years, raw human fear. "I don't want to lose you too," he said softly. I felt my chest tighten. After everything, after the betrayal, after the distance, those words still pierced deeper than any courtroom testimony. "You won't lose me," I said quietly. "Not if you choose the truth." For a long moment, Mason didn't move. Then slowly he nodded. "I'll speak," I exhaled. Not relief, not victory, just release. The knowledge that the choice wasn't mine to force, but his to make, and he had made it. The following morning, the courtroom felt different. The air still tense, the faces still wary, but something subtle had shifted. Douglas looked restless, tapping his pen against the table. My mother sat rigid, her expression carved from ice. When Mason was called, a collective breath filled the room. He rose slowly, hands shaking slightly as he took the oath. I watched him climb those steps, the same man who had spent his life avoiding conflict now stepping directly into its fire. His voice was soft at first, but with every word, every sentence, his steadiness grew. He spoke of the emails, the financial irregularities, the forged documents. He admitted quietly but clearly that he had seen it all, and he named names. Douglas, our mother. He laid it bare piece by piece until the courtroom sat in stunned silence. I felt something hot sting my eyes, but I refused to look away. When Mason finished, he didn't look at Douglas. He looked at me, and in that glance, everything between us, the childhood secrets, the shared loneliness, the long years of unspoken words, healed, if only slightly. He had chosen. Douglas's face twisted in barely contained rage. My mother's eyes glistened, her mask slipping for the first time. But it didn't matter. The line had been drawn. The truth had been spoken. As Mason returned to his seat, he paused by my chair. He didn't say anything, but he didn't need to. I had not stood alone after all. And now, with the path set and the truth unleashed, I knew this was the moment the tide turned. The decision had been made. The final morning felt unnervingly calm. The kind of stillness you only recognize when you've lived through storms. I sat quietly at the plaintiff's table, my fingers tracing the edges of the tan folder, resting beside me the same folder that held everything. Every lie, every betrayal, every secret they never thought would see the light. I could feel Douglas's eyes on me across the room, sharp, predatory. My mother sat beside him, her expression unreadable, carved into something colder than stone. And Mason sat behind them, his hands folded in his lap, still but no longer silent. The judge called the session to order. The gavel struck once, echoing through the room. My attorney stood first, presenting the closing arguments with calm precision. Every word was deliberate. Every fact stacked carefully like stones in a wall that could no longer be breached. Then came the moment. "Your Honor," my attorney said, her voice steady, "the defense has repeatedly questioned my client's integrity. Today we present definitive evidence, not only refuting those claims, but exposing an extensive pattern of fraud perpetrated by the plaintiffs themselves." She nodded toward me. I rose, taking the folder in my hands. My footsteps felt heavier than usual, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of what I was about to do. As I approached the bench, I caught Mason's gaze just for a second. He gave the smallest of nods. I placed the folder on the judge's desk. Everything after that moved in surreal, slow motion. The judge adjusted his glasses and flipped the first page. For a moment, there was only the sound of paper sliding between fingertips. His brow furrowed, his eyes darkened. And then in a voice low but sharp, he spoke words I will never forget. "No one move. Close the doors. Now." The courtroom gasped. Chairs scraped the floor. Before anyone could fully process what was happening, 2 uniformed military police officers entered through the side doors, their faces expressionless, their movements crisp and controlled. I didn't move. I didn't need to. The judge looked up, his voice rising just enough to carry through the stunned room. "This court is now in immediate possession of evidence suggesting criminal fraud involving federal military benefits, forged legal documents, and obstruction of justice." Douglas's face drained of color in an instant. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. His lawyer, who just hours earlier had stood so confidently, dropped every sheet of paper he was holding. They scattered to the floor like dead leaves. My mother sat frozen, her eyes wide, her lips trembling but silent. She looked not at me but at the judge, as though the gravity of what was unfolding had finally begun to settle in. The military police moved methodically, standing guard at both doors. One officer approached the bench to receive instructions. The judge handed over the folder without hesitation. The silence was unbearable and beautiful. I returned to my seat without looking at Douglas, without looking at my mother. I kept my eyes forward, hands resting calmly in my lap, the air around me thick with tension, but inside me only stillness. I had delivered the truth. The truth was now alive, undeniable, irreversible. The judge called for a brief recess to allow for the preliminary review of the new evidence. The court clerk and bailiffs moved quickly, their faces tight with urgency. Douglas tried to rise, perhaps to speak to his attorney, but the military police signaled him to remain seated. I saw the panic, the unraveling, the realization dawning on them that their world, the lies they had so carefully constructed, was beginning to collapse. I thought I would feel triumph. I thought I would feel anger or vindication or even relief. But I felt none of those things. What I felt was peace, not because I had won, not yet, but because I had done what I came to do. I had stood my ground. I had spoken the truth. And now the system, the law, would carry the rest forward. Mason sat perfectly still, his face pale, but his eyes locked on mine for the briefest of moments. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. The decision he had made, the one that set this moment into motion, was written all over his face. When the judge returned, he confirmed that the evidence warranted immediate investigation at the federal level. The civil case would be suspended pending further criminal inquiries. Douglas slumped in his seat. My mother visibly shook. And I remained upright. The gavel struck once more. The hearing adjourned. The war wasn't completely over. But the battle had been won. I stood, exhaled, and for the first time in what felt like years, I allowed myself to breathe without fear. The bombshell had landed, and I was still standing. The truth has a strange way of revealing itself, not always in shouts or dramatic outbursts, but sometimes in quiet, methodical precision. That morning, when the judge returned and the courtroom doors remained firmly shut under the watch of military police, I knew the unraveling had begun. The folder I handed over wasn't just paper and ink. It was a map of deceit, each document a piece of the puzzle that exposed everything Douglas and my mother had so carefully constructed. Every forged signature, every manipulated bank transfer, every twisted legal maneuver, it was all there. The judge's voice was even, but I could hear the shift beneath it. The shift from civil disagreement to criminal exposure. The first revelation came with the financial records funds, supposedly earmarked for veterans' charities. Charities Douglas claimed to support in my name had been siphoned into private accounts. Accounts linked directly to both him and my mother. Not just embezzlement, not just greed, but the exploitation of my military service, the very core of my identity, twisted into a tool for profit. I watched as Douglas's face drained of color. His lawyer fumbled through papers that no longer mattered. Every lie they had carefully spun was being dismantled in real time. The second revelation cut deeper. The forensic analysis of my father's will. The amendments filed mere weeks before his death bore signatures that didn't match the originals. The ink was fresh. The language legal but rushed, reeked of manipulation. The amendments, it turned out, had been prepared by an attorney on Douglas's payroll, not my father's long-standing legal counsel. The judge read from the findings without emotion, but the weight of the words hit like hammers. Forgery, he said, pausing to look over the rim of his glasses. Document tampering. Potential conspiracy to defraud. My mother flinched. For the first time, her mask cracked. Her hands trembled. Her eyes darted wild, desperate, seeking something, someone to anchor her. But Douglas kept his stare forward, jaw locked, as if sheer will alone could stop the collapse. And then came the final thread, the emails. Those emails were the backbone of the case. Chains of correspondence between Douglas and my mother, discussing the plan to contest the will, to discredit my service, to remove me not just from the inheritance, but from the family entirely. They spoke casually of my weakness, of how no one will believe her, because no one ever has. I felt the words in my bones colder than any winter I'd ever known. And yet in the middle of that cold, there was a flicker of warmth. Mason. He sat on the witness bench now. Hands folded, his voice quiet but steady as he answered each question. He confirmed the authenticity of the emails. He explained how he had stumbled upon them accidentally, how he wrestled with whether to come forward. He admitted his fear, his shame, his hesitation, but he came, he chose, and for that, I would carry gratitude for the rest of my life. I didn't look at Douglas. I didn't need to. I could feel the fury radiating off him. His plan, months, maybe years in the making, was disintegrating before his eyes. My mother didn't speak. She didn't cry. She simply sat as if frozen, her world crumbling piece by piece. The judge's ruling was swift and decisive. The civil claims against me were dismissed entirely. The house, my father's house, was confirmed as rightfully mine. But more than that, the judge ordered an immediate criminal investigation into both Douglas and my mother for fraud, forgery, and misuse of charitable funds. I heard the whispers ripple through the courtroom. Reporters scribbled notes. Lawyers exchanged hushed words. I remained still. Not out of coldness, not out of triumph, but because something deeper settled in me, a quiet, unshakable knowing that I had done what needed to be done. The truth had unfolded. The lies lay bare. As the judge adjourned the session, I stood slowly gathering my things. Mason approached, tentative, uncertain. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, eyes downcast. "Thank you," I whispered. He nodded, swallowing hard. I should have done it sooner. I offered him the smallest of smiles. "You did it when it mattered." Douglas was still seated, motionless, his lawyer leaning in to whisper in his ear. My mother sat beside him, her hands twisting together, her face pale and distant. They didn't look at me, not once. I stepped out into the sunlight, blinking at the brightness, the weight on my chest finally beginning to lift. The fight wasn't over. Legal battles would stretch on. Investigations would follow. But the worst part, the part where they could shape my story, my name, my life, was finished. The truth was no longer buried. And for the first time in years, I felt free. It's a strange thing, the moment when everything breaks. You imagine it'll come with screaming, with fists slammed against tables, with chaos too loud to bear. But when it finally happened, when Douglas unraveled right there in the middle of the courtroom, it came with silence first. Absolute, suffocating silence. The judge's gavel still echoed faintly in my ears, as Douglas stood unsteady, his face stripped of the smooth arrogance he had worn like armor for so long. His lawyer tugged at his sleeve, whispering urgently, but Douglas barely heard him. His eyes darted around the room, searching for something he couldn't seem to find. I stayed seated. My hands rested on the polished wood in front of me. My breathing was even. From the outside, I must have looked calm, composed, victorious even. But inside, something entirely different unfolded. Douglas's voice cracked when he finally spoke. "This is wrong," he muttered. "She's lying. She's always been, she's—" His words faltered, fell apart, mid-sentence. I watched, not with anger, not even with satisfaction, but with something heavier, sorrow. The man before me wasn't the brother I remembered from childhood, the one who once carried me on his shoulders at the county fair, who once taught me how to skip stones across the bay. That version of Douglas had long since vanished, replaced by ambition, by greed, by something colder that I could no longer reach. He sank back into his seat. His hands trembled. His mother, our mother, sat frozen beside him, her eyes glassy, her expression unreadable. For the first time in my life, I wondered if she was finally seeing the truth, or if she was still clinging to the fantasy they had built together. And then Mason. He stood from his place in the gallery, slow, almost hesitant. His shoulders shook. His head was bowed, his hands wiping at his eyes in quiet desperation. I had never seen him cry. Not once. Not even when we were children, when bruises and heartbreaks had been easier to collect. Now he wept, and something inside me splintered. I rose quietly and met him halfway across the floor, unsure what instinct drove me there. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I simply placed a hand on his shoulder. He pressed his palm to his face, shaking the weight of his choice, of the destruction it had wrought, written across every line of his body. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking. I shook my head gently. "You have nothing to be sorry for." His eyes, red swollen, lifted to meet mine. I broke them. "No," I said softly. "They broke themselves. You just stop pretending not to see it." The bailiffs moved quietly in the background, speaking to Douglas's legal team, escorting my mother to the side room as the paperwork for formal investigation began. But none of that mattered in that moment. Not to me, not to Mason. We stood there, two survivors of the same wreckage, both of us carrying different wounds, but somehow finally finding each other in the aftermath. I realized then that I didn't hate Douglas. I didn't even hate my mother. What I felt was deeper than hate. It was grief. Grief for the family we might have been. For the years we could never reclaim. For the small, fragile hopes I had clung to longer than I ever should have. Mason exhaled sharply, steadying himself, wiping his face one last time before nodding. He returned to his seat, quieter now, but changed. And I took my place again. Calm, steady, but with a heart heavier than I thought possible. The judge finalized the proceedings, his words sounding distant through the roar of emotion filling my chest. Dismissal of claims, initiation of criminal charges, property rights restored. All formal, all necessary. But none of it truly mattered in the way people might think. What mattered was that I had stood my ground without losing myself. That I had spoken the truth without resorting to the same cruelty they had wielded against me. What mattered was that Mason had found his voice. The courtroom slowly emptied. Reporters buzzed outside. Photographers clicked from the courthouse steps. I could hear the faint shouts of questions I would never answer. As I stepped through the heavy wooden doors, sunlight washed over me, bright, too bright after the dim courtroom. I didn't look back. Because some chapters don't need to be revisited. Some endings write themselves not with fire or fury, but with quiet, steady resilience. And though my heart still ached, though part of me always would, I knew this, I was still standing. And I was free. I once believed that when the truth came out, everything would fall neatly into place. That justice, once served, would stitch together what had been torn apart. But I was wrong. The days following the courtroom collapse were quieter than I expected, eerily so. Douglas vanished from public view. My mother, too, retreated into silence, her phone calls unanswered, her name left unspoken. The once proud Carter family, whose name adorned hotel walls and charity galas, was suddenly a ghost. A ruin. But it wasn't the public reaction that haunted me. It was Mason. He drifted somewhere in the middle, neither fully standing beside me nor entirely condemned with them. I could see it in his eyes when he visited the house one afternoon. Hands buried deep in his coat pockets, his shoulders slumped under a weight even he couldn't define. "They won't speak to me," he said quietly, barely above a whisper. "Not even Mom." I poured him tea. I didn't know what else to do. "They say I betrayed them," he continued. "That I destroyed the family. I keep thinking. Maybe I did." I set the cup down and looked him in the eye. "You didn't destroy anything, Mason. They did that themselves." But I knew the guilt inside him wasn't something that words could mend. The lines in his face were sharper now, the air around him heavy with regret. Even though he had chosen truth, the cost of that choice was steep, and it was written across every movement he made. Some people would call him brave, others would call him weak for waiting so long to act. I knew the whispers were already starting online, in hushed conversations, in the sideways glances we received in town. Was Mason truly innocent, or had he only switched sides when it was safe to do so? The question hung in the air between us, unspoken but present. And though I never doubted his heart, I couldn't deny the complexity of what he had done or failed to do for so many years. I didn't press him. I didn't demand an explanation. Because I understood something most people never would. Survival in a family like ours often meant silence. Breaking that silence required not just courage, but sacrifice. As the sun dipped lower over the cliffs, we sat together in quiet, no forgiveness offered, none required. Just two people trying to make sense of the pieces left behind. And somehow, that had to be enough. I thought the hardest part would be the fight itself, the trial, the lies, the public exposure. But I was wrong. The hardest part came after. When the dust settled and the shouting stopped. When all that remained was the hollow ache of everything we'd lost. I spent hours walking the shoreline behind the Monterey house, tracing the waterline the way I used to as a child. The same waves that had once felt so endless, so full of promise, now carried the quiet weight of memory and regret. I thought about my father, how he'd loved this place, how he'd believed naively that the family he built could hold together after he was gone. I wondered what he would think if he could see us now, fractured, divided, hollowed out by greed and betrayal. I thought about my mother, the way she looked through me in court, the way her voice never wavered as she stood against me. I had spent so many years trying to understand her, trying to earn her approval, her warmth, her pride. But somewhere along the way, I'd stopped asking for it. And then there was Douglas, the brother I once admired, then feared, then finally came to pity. I didn't hate him, not anymore. Somewhere in the wreckage of everything we had endured, I had let go of that hate. Because hate is heavy. It corrodes from the inside. And after carrying it for too many years, I was tired. Somewhere along the way, I learned that letting go wasn't weakness. It was survival. I couldn't change what had been done. I couldn't force apologies that would never come. But I could choose what to carry forward. And I chose this. I chose to forgive, not because they deserved it, but because I did. I chose to stop chasing what had never been mine, their love, their validation, their acceptance. I chose to stand alone if that's what it meant to finally be free. As the tide pulled back toward the horizon, I felt something shift inside me, not joy, not relief, but something steadier. The quiet resolve of a person who had faced the fire and come out whole, not untouched, but whole. And sometimes that was enough. The public has a short memory. For weeks after the trial, my name was everywhere. Local news, online forums, podcasts dissecting the Carter family scandal with all the nuance of a tabloid headline. Some called me a hero. Others called me a liar who had somehow gotten lucky. A few questioned whether the entire case had been staged for sympathy or financial gain. The pendulum swung back and forth, praise, doubt, outrage, admiration. But none of it mattered. Not really. Because the real truth was that I didn't need their approval. Not anymore. I wasn't the villain Douglas tried to create. But I also wasn't the hero the headlines tried to paint. I was something far messier, far more human, a woman who had made mistakes, who had carried wounds both visible and hidden, who had fought for something that could never fully be restored. My military record was cleared. The false accusations were formally withdrawn. I received quiet apologies from some who had once looked the other way. But the damage, the deeper kind, couldn't be undone. I wasn't angry about it. I wasn't bitter. I had simply outgrown it. I attended one public event, a veterans charity gala, months later. The applause was polite, the handshakes genuine. But I could still feel it, the undercurrent of curiosity, of discomfort. As though people didn't know quite what to make of me. And that was fine. Because I wasn't there for them. I was there for the ones who would never get to tell their stories. The ones who came home in pieces physically, emotionally, and whose truths would never make headlines. I was there for me. The Monterey house became my sanctuary. I restored the garden my father once tended. I started volunteering quietly at a local outreach center for veterans. I stopped checking the news. I stopped explaining myself. I lived. Not as a symbol. Not as a cautionary tale. But as a woman who had finally claimed the right to define herself. And in the end, that was the victory no one could take from me. The house by the sea has always been my anchor. After the trial, after the headlines faded and the legal battles settled into the background noise of distant memory, I came home not to a family, not to applause, but to the one place that never betrayed me. The Monterey house stood just as I remembered it. Weathered wood, salt-streaked windows. The garden overgrown, but still breathing beneath years of neglect. I spent my first morning there in silence, fingertips brushing across old furniture, listening to the wind carry memories through half-open doors. I didn't rush to fill the space. I let it remain simple, bare, honest. I started tending the garden again, slowly, patiently. Hands in the soil, knees pressed to the earth, I found something I hadn't realized I was missing: stillness. The kind that doesn't demand answers. The kind that allows you to simply exist. I wrote. Pages filled with stories I'd carried for decades. Some from distant battlefields, some from quiet childhood afternoons. I didn't write for publication. I wrote for the woman I had become. For the girl I had once been. For the life I was still piecing together. Mason visited sometimes. He never stayed long. He never spoke much, but when he came, we sat on the porch with coffee watching the sun dip below the water, the sky bleeding gold and violet. We didn't talk about the trial, or the family, or the things we'd lost. Instead, we talked about music, about the books he was reading, about the small things that somehow felt like everything when the world finally slows down enough to notice. I forgave him, silently, not with words but with presence. And he, in his own quiet way, forgave me too for the distance, for the years we both let slip away. I learned to live without the noise of the past. I learned that healing doesn't arrive all at once. It creeps in soft, hesitant like sunlight through cracked windows. And most of all, I learned that sometimes peace isn't something you find. Sometimes it's something you build one breath, one choice, one moment at a time. It took me longer than I care to admit to understand that survival wasn't the end of my story. For so long, I believed that standing through the courtroom battles, through the betrayals and the heartbreak, was the finish line. But as the weeks stretched into months, I realized endings aren't always sharp. Sometimes they dissolve into beginnings so quiet you barely notice them. I stopped counting the days since the verdict. I stopped measuring my life by what I had lost. Instead, I started planting roses. At first it felt trivial, strange even. But as the first buds appeared, soft pinks, deep reds, I found something gentle in myself I thought had died years before. It wasn't just about flowers. It was about nurturing something fragile, something alive. I woke with the sunrise. I slept without nightmares. The weight in my chest lightened, not gone, but softer, more bearable. Mason continued to visit. The distance between us thinned not through dramatic confessions or sweeping reconciliations, but through the simple act of showing up. He helped me build a new fence. He brought me seeds for the garden. Sometimes we sat for hours without speaking, and somehow those silences healed more than words ever could. I didn't chase forgiveness from Douglas or my mother. I didn't seek explanations that would never come. I let them be ghosts in my story, present, but no longer defining. For the first time in my life, I wasn't anyone's disappointment. I wasn't anyone's scapegoat. I was just me. I found myself in the sound of waves in the pages of half-finished manuscripts, in the smell of lavender carried by the sea breeze. I learned to love the quiet. I learned to find meaning without struggle. I wasn't the hero people wanted me to be. I wasn't the villain others painted me to be. I was simply a woman who survived, who chose not to let bitterness take root, who, when given every reason to hate, chose instead to begin again. And for me, that was enough. If you've stayed with me this far, I want to thank you. Not just for listening, but for witnessing, for sitting beside me through the dark, through the fire, through the quiet places in between. This isn't a story about victory in the way most people think of it. It's not about winning or proving something to the world. It's about reclaiming what was mine from the start, my dignity, my name, my peace. It's about the long, slow process of standing back up after you've been knocked down not once, but over and over. It's about learning that forgiveness isn't always something you give to others. Sometimes it's something you give to yourself. We live in a world quick to judge, quick to abandon, quick to turn pain into spectacle. I know that better than most. But I also know this: there is power in telling the truth. There is power in surviving. And there is immense power in choosing to begin again, without hatred, without bitterness, without the need for revenge. I don't know what battles you're fighting. I don't know what wounds you carry, but I know you're still here. And sometimes that's the bravest thing of all. If this story touched something in you, I hope you'll carry it forward. Share it. Hold space for the people in your life who need to hear that broken doesn't mean defeated. And if you need a reminder, you are not what they say about you. You are not the worst thing that ever happened to you. You are worthy of starting over, of peace, of joy, of coming home to yourself. Thank you for being part of this journey. Before we say goodbye, we'd love to know, where are you watching from? Is it a quiet morning with a warm cup of coffee, or a late night where stories like this keep you company? Let us know in the comments. We read everyone with gratitude. And if this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to the channel, not just to hear more stories like this, but to be part of a community that still believes in kindness, healing, and second chances. Thank you for spending your time with us today, wherever you are. We hope you carry this story with you, and remember, sometimes the miracle doesn't knock on your door. It waits quietly until you're ready to open your heart. Take care, and we'll see you in the next story.